Hey folks, it's Sam, and I'm here speaking with Alix Claman. She's going to be talking today about the Rahu and Ketu and our genius, developing our psychic gifts. And she's going to be presenting this at the Next Generation of Vedic Astrology Conference. And I'm going to be having her share her inspirations and how she came about this subject and whatnot. So Alix, take it away.
Hi, Sam. Thanks. I find this subject to be really fascinating. Even in my work with just studying my own chart, Rahu and Ketu are always these forces, like I say, even in this description beyond the matrix. They're like in the subconscious. They're not always on the forefront. And so when we look at them, when I've been studying them, even for myself, I keep having these epiphanies and these realizations when I really study them and look into them. And so I find them really, just like I said, fascinating to talk about, because they are these subconscious forces that are running so much of our lives without sometimes us being really aware of them. And so bringing attention to them is really fun and kind of a deep dive into our subconscious.
And the psychic gifts is a lot of what you were mentioning here as well. Mm-hmm. Like, how does that play into it? That's a big part of what you're going to be explaining, as we've talked about already as well.
Yeah. And this is the thing, is that it's especially we see it with Rahu, but certainly Ketu too. It just takes a little bit more sight. But it really is these energies in our chart that, like I said, they're happening on the subconscious. So we may not always see the way that they are creating these accelerated gifts in our life, or this really deep perception into something that's more Ketu. And it's like, when we study it, when we look at it, we're like, wow. And everybody has this somewhere in their charts, this deep perception of Ketu and this kind of accelerated perception of Rahu. And so when we look into it, we do get to see, how these forces work for us, and the gifts and the psychic gifts that are playing out in our lives. And especially if they're connected to a planet, in terms of what I'm going to be sharing, then we see how their energies affect that specific planet's frequency in our chart. And that's cool to see how that really dials in the gift even a little bit more.
Yeah. And so you said about your chart. So how did you talked about it in your life? So how? So you opened it up. So all right.
Well, I have Rahu in the 8th, and I've always really gone towards very intense, dramatic situations. I've always been into shamanism and these kind of deep dives into the psyche and working things through. And I have Ketu therefore in the 2nd. And I've noticed that I'm always looking for the next really powerful experience. But I don't always have a really steady routine with eating. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Okay. I have this really profound perception with Rahu in my 8th of these very mysterious realms. But on the day-to-day, I don't even have a steady routine to feed myself. And it's like, oh, that's Ketu,
There you go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's even just shown in the houses, right? In the house axis, yeah. not the sun, not join any planets or anything like that. So it's that's
just one aspect.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so again, we all have this desire to accelerate, like you say, accelerated perception. It's beyond. Rahu wants to push it beyond, in a certain area of life. It's okay. This thing is not moving fast enough. I need to get more of it. So with 8th house, it's like transformation, even, danger, or things that are bringing me into a deeper perception of the 8th house fears and vulnerabilities. But like you said, Ketu, the other end of the node, which again, we're going to talk, you'll explain this, is where we tend to overlook things. So explain that in a general sense, like how the Ketu Rahu axis works.
Well, this is where I also say beyond the matrix, because they're the Chaya Grahas, they're the shadow planets. And so they're really working on this kind of other realm, kind of outside of our normal body-mind perception. And they're this axis within the chart. Rahu's always on one end and Ketu is exactly opposite. and they're pulling us. They're like this karmic energy. Rahu is accelerating us, pulling us like outside of ourselves to try to experience something that is new to us, something that new territory. You know, that's why we call Rahu like the army that's like moving forward, conquering new territory, and always thirsty for more, pulling us outside of ourselves to experience something that we haven't experienced yet. And Ketu is the occupying army, where Ketu is kind of just something we've already done. And many times astrologers talk about it like past lives. It's also just simply our childhood, somewhere that we've been before, experiences that are really ingrained in our subconscious. And so it's something that we feel really like confident in a sense, but there's also a lot of critique. There's a lot of scrutiny, like we should already know everything about that energy. And so Ketu is like, we miss things sometimes with Ketu. We have a really fine-tuned perception, but we also miss things because we just assume, oh, I know that.
Right. And then overlook it like, oh, that's not so important. This food or whatever. What's really important is all this other stuff, like in that case.
Exactly.
And when you said, how does that relate to psychic ability, as you're saying?
Well, it relates to psychic ability because it's outside the body-mind paradigm. So it's these forces like that are working on a subconscious level. They're also, and in that way, they're tuned to kind of otherworldly frequencies. They're a different kind of energy. They're not something that you see. That's like very, we're not very present. So it's tuned into something different. And I find that to be really powerful because with Rahu Ketu, if we're aware of them, you know, then we're tuning this kind of otherworldly frequency to something that's really present and that we can navigate in like real time. And if we're not aware of it, then that's where it brings in, like I said, confusion, because it's, like I said, not in this body mind, it's in some other paradigm. And so we're tuned to some like other frequency, otherworldly energy, which brings in that genius and those gifts, but it can also bring a lot of confusion if we're not aware of it.
And that's really what psychic ability is. That's why one of the things that people learn a lot is really how to harness your own psychic ability, but part of it is also to define things. I find I have to do this a lot when I teach some things. I first have to really define what it is because people are so confused about even things that they say all the time, like, oh, psychic. What is psychic? Psychic ability just means knowing things beyond your sensory perceptions and whatnot. And we all have a certain ability with this, and it comes from the nodes.
Yeah.
But we often don't harness it. And sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just drama and triggering. Other times it's actually something reliable. So we can harness that part of our nature. And so especially when the plant, when like you have here Rahu and Ketu and their conjunction with planets, really shows specific types of psychic ability. Like Rahu or Ketu joined Mercury, it's going to show a accelerated maybe psychic ability with information, or if it's joined the moon with feelings into the emotions of others, like accelerated perceptions, or the sun, accelerated perceptions about power and whatnot, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's where, again, we really like dive in and fine tune it with the planets, because as we're saying, everyone has these otherworldly psychic abilities, these geniuses in these areas, because we all have Rahu and Ketu. But then when we look at them joined planets, we see, as you're saying, how their specific energies influence that planet as a Karaka. And that can just show the more specifications of these gifts that people have.
Yeah, and even so with the house and sign placement as well, even if you don't have them joined planets, just the house and the sign, like you said, the house was the 8th house, but I know that's also the sign of Aquarius. So again, when you look at Aquarius, that's also about communities, and I happen to know with you, like you're so into the communities and the communal, and again, Rahu is like obsessed with that. Like, okay, Ketu is in the 2nd house, and again, it's the sign of Leo, which is like personal power and your own confidence and whatnot. Like, okay, that's important, but this is the real important part. Rahu is like, yeah, but you got to share it in this big community, right?
Yes, totally. And that's another thing. It's why, I mean, with my chart, they're not joined any planets, but
Yeah.
I've been really studying this quality again of Rahu in Aquarius in my 8th. And it's much easier for me to understand that Rahu aspect because it's that thing that's pulling me outside of myself, and this obsession with make sure everybody's, serve everybody. You're not important. The whole is important. And then when I tune in with Ketu and Leo, it's like, oh, wait a minute. So are you. Like, remember your own power. But Ketu takes a little bit more effort and self-examination to really dig into. But when that axis is harmonized, then we really see this potent karma that is able to really actualize in our life.
Well, and you also see, this is always what happens with the nodes, is they bring up the polarity between the houses and the signs. And again, it's very simple. You could even just attach a couple really, simple keywords, which is a lot of the way we teach in the school and whatnot. You could literally say Rahu in the 8th in Aquarius is obsessed with transformation in large groups. Mm-hmm. You could just say that, like, simple. These are just keywords, right? Yeah. But the only way to have transformation in large groups is to also be grounded in your own values and have your own personal strength and identity solid enough. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to transform a group if you're completely lost yourself.
Yeah. Totally.
Boom. So it brings this enormous clarity, and it brings your capacity. You also have a natural, and again, because wherever Rahu is, we're kind of obsessed with that. So we have a natural, psychic ability and gift to really try to develop that thing. Yeah. So because you've been so obsessed with it, you now learn, this is the thing that the community needs. And again, nobody has to tell you because Rahu is developing that part of you naturally, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is how the psychic gift gets really developed with the Rahu end. And again, we can overlook the Ketu end because we feel like we've already been there and done that. But sometimes that's some of the deepest stuff. Because then once you start working with people in the group individually, and I know this about you because I've gotten the feedback from others about you and because I know you as well, but that Ketu in your second house shows where all of that experience that we've had really comes into play when we start to engage, especially as a healer. So you can really understand like other people's childhood wounds and trauma and all of that stuff. You just naturally get it because Ketu in the second made you very aware of that. Even though you might not see it so much in yourself, you can see it in others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And it's really, that's why I'm so fascinated about this topic and why I'm wanting to teach on it, is because the more that we discuss it and the more that people are even listening to the class and they're digesting it and thinking about their own charts, it's like so much awareness of these gifts that we have that, like you said, we may not see, or maybe we're too polarized in the Rahu, and then we kind of pull ourselves back in and see. Right. There's so much awareness that can come from it, really seeing how we are really attuned. We all have these gifts that are very unique to us.
And it's a much needed examination of Rahu and Ketu beyond the cartoonish bad. Oh, it's bad. My favorite thing. But it's so valuable, especially to talk about these, any of the malefic quote energies, particularly the nodes, because they're so prominent in a way that's liberating, because there's so much energy put in that nodal axis, whether we know it or not, even if it's not joined planets. But when it joins planets, it develops that even more.
Yes. Definitely. And I think that's the thing, is the malefics they're such transformational energies in our lives. They really have us. That's why Ketu is sometimes coupled with similarities with Mars, and Rahu with Saturn. And we see how much we learn from our Mars and Saturn experiences, this fight or flight and these very tamasic energies. And so to dive into them and to understand how they teach and what they're teaching makes them a little less scary and a little more like relatable and understandable and digestible. And then so much growth can come because we see that they're actually these planets that deliver us such gifts if we're aware of what they're doing.
Yeah. And even when we're not, and then again, this is the thing to understand, is that all the planets are always delivering us gifts, whether we know it or not, but it's better to know it. Because then you're not just learning through, and again, this is really kind of the difference between the quote benefics and the malefics, is that what happens is, regardless, there's a quality of confusion that comes from the nodes. There's always going to be a confusion about it, but there's a quality of confusion that is very beneficial for our soul, because we need to just trust our own instinct and act. And this is what happens when we're confused. But it's better to understand and really clarify what those areas are, so we're not just confused about being confused. Yes.
Yes. Yes. And I've seen, you know, a lot. I've been sort of, since initiating this topic, I've been talking to people who have specifically nodes joined planets, and I've been starting to have discussions and really seeing the people. There's some people who are really confused based on nodal placements, like especially nodes with the moon is like, I'm like, wow. And then there are other people where you see these placements and they have this really dialed in perception or awareness, and there's such a variant of energies. There's such a spectrum with these nodes and how they play out in people's lives. So I'm really excited too to like look at case studies and just discuss it. It's very complex, these nodes.
Great. Yeah. Well, this is fantastic. And Alix, I'm so glad that you took some time to explain this to us. Really looking forward to it. This is going to be a great class as well. And so again, thank you for spending some time with us today and explaining this class on our psychic abilities and perceptions and the nodal axis.
Yeah. Thank you too.